guys. It is Saturday afternoon and it is 4:00. That means it is time for our Reach weekly Bible study, where we've been studying through the book of Luke, and we're getting near the end. Not quite, still through around a couple bends, but we're getting there. A couple reminders before we start. As usual, we're happy you're here. We all come from different backgrounds. We have different experiences. Excuse me. And that's a good thing. We can learn from each other as we learn more about God. And also, if you do like to talk a lot, that's great. We appreciate you sharing. Sometimes it takes some other people a little bit more time to get their thoughts together, be able to express themselves. We just like to make sure that everyone has a chance to share. So we just like to put that out there. And we always like to start with a word of prayer. So I ask you to join me as I open up our study today. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity to study your word, and for the people that are here on the Zoom call, and for those that might be listening somewhere else, either right now or they found us sometime in the future. Lord, I ask you to be with us as we open up your word in the book of Luke. I ask you to be with Justin as he guides our conversation. And Lord, most importantly, I ask you to send your Holy Spirit to each home, and that you will guide and the Holy Spirit will enlighten us to what exactly you want us to learn from this passage today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Laura. So nice to see all of you. We're starting with a kickoff question. When was a time when you were severely punished? When was a time when you were severely punished, or just punished, if severely is throwing you off? Aaron.
I got punished when I was little. Well, not little, like elementary maybe, or middle school. I can't remember how old I was. But I got I couldn't go outside and play. And I got grounded. And I remember I was like begging my dad. I was like, please, I'll be good. I was like, "I'll go outside." And he's like, no. So I had to stay inside. I didn't get to go out and play. That was my punishment.
Thank you. Anybody else? When was a time when you were severely punished? Sarah.
This was in school, and I don't know if we were having a test or we were doing something, but for some reason, I looked over onto my friend's paper, and I guess the teacher was there and caught me and basically told me to leave the room.
All right. Who else? Phyllis.
This was when I was about 4, maybe. And this was back when you had ink and ink pens that you dipped the pen in and, got the ink out of a bottle. Well, my mom had that in her dresser drawer, the top drawer, along with some other things. And I got in there playing around and took the top off and spilled the bottle of ink all in her dresser drawer. So there was no denying. And every time after that, it's like for years, you could open up that dresser drawer and there's the ink spot still. So you're reminded over and over again. But anyway, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm debating whether to ask how old you are, because I thought that those pins were like a long time, like not like I'm joking, because like it's a different generation. Like
no, it was like this, and it had a little lever on the side. It wasn't like a quill. I'm not that old.
Yes, there you go. All right. Thanks for playing along with the joke. All right, Lori.
I remember one that involved my mom too. I was about 5, and when I was that age, we lived at a house that was on the corner, a corner lot without a full fence around. I don't remember exactly what I did to get in trouble, but what got me in trouble was I took off and I started running from my mom around the house, thinking she'll never catch me. Well, my mom was smarter than me. She reversed directions. As I'm running around the house, she ran the other way to catch me. And I can remember doing that. And of course, I was in more trouble because I took off running from her. And I remember having to stay in my room, for the rest of the time. But I just remember getting in trouble because I thought I was smarter than her to run from her for whatever I did.
Great story. I was once given a black bag and a pair of scissors by a school teacher and told to go cut every dandelion out of this like multi-acre field outside the school. It created a rather serious reaction from me, which then led to further punishment. But yeah, so that was I never did cut the dandelions. I forget what the other punishment. Oh, the other punishment was I ended up in the principal's classroom for like a week. That's what it was. Yeah. So okay. Anybody else? Time you were severely punished? All right. We're in Luke 21. Well, we actually are going to start off in verse 20. Sorry, chapter 20. We're going to start in chapter 20. We're going to end in chapter 21. Did you get that, Sarah? We're going to start in chapter 20. We're going to end in chapter 21. So let's start in chapter 20, verse 39.
Okay.
And then we're going to read through chapter 21, verse 4.
Okay. Gotcha.
There we go. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Clearing up. Thanks. Yeah.
All right. Who would like to read this for us? 39 of chapter 20 through verse 4 of chapter 21.
I will.
All right. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay. I'm reading today in the New International Version. And it reads, some of the teachers of law responded, well said, teacher, and no one dared to ask him any more questions. Then Jesus said to them, why is it said that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself declares in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. David calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? While all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely. As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in there 2 very small copper coins. Truly, I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's do a quick recap. What was happening before this? What have we been studying since Jesus arrived in Jerusalem?
Talking about the resurrection,
But before that,
paying taxes,
and before that,
His authority was questioned.
yeah.
sure. And before that,
You drove them out of the temple.
right. We went over this last week. We'll probably go over it again next week. So pay attention. What does Jesus do when he arrives in Jerusalem? Cleanses the temple. There's the whole thing with the wicked tenants, right? And then what happens after that?
The taxes thing.
Paying to Caesar what's Caesar's.
Okay, so
To God is God.
sure, those great. Those are like the teachings, but what's actually happening? What compels Jesus to say, give unto Caesar that which is Caesar?
Well, they're trying to trick him into doing something so they can arrest him.
There we go. So that the Jewish leaders have approached Jesus with a series of questions, right? That's the most recent event. One of those is a question about taxes. They send two groups of people who have two very different opinions about the taxes, so that Jesus can't answer the question. If he answers it one way, it'll offend one group, another way, it'll offend the other group. Then the Sadducees, a third group, shows up and asks him about the resurrection. So the Pharisees and the Herodians show up and ask him about taxes. Then the Sadducees show up and ask him about the resurrection, as Phyllis said, in order to trip him up. I think that's a great thing to think about, because what happens in today's story?
Jesus asks a question.
That's right. So this is a little different now, isn't it?
Mhm.
All right. What question does he ask?
Whose son is the Messiah?
Of all the different questions Jesus could have asked, why do you think he asked this one? Phyllis.
I think ultimately he's trying to get them to think about who he is and to come to the revelation themselves that he is the Christ and the son of David as well.
Anybody else want to expound or have a different opinion? Why does Jesus ask this question?
Sorry, what is this question?
What is the question?
I mean,
Verse-
so my
yeah.
version says, how is it that they say Christ is David's son? Is David's son then for like another term for Messiah?
The question is, how is it they say, how can they say that the Messiah is David's son? That's the question. That's the question.
That is, okay,
That's what Jesus asked them.
okay. And why is he asking?
Why is he asking that question?
I have no answer to your question
Okay.
or his question.
Well, could it
All
be because they're still trying to figure out who he is?
Some are, it seems.
Yeah.
Aaron?
Is it because the Messiah is supposed to come from the line of Judah and David is from that line?
That
Like,
is true.
Establishing his genealogy, or
The root of Jesse, right? Who's Jesse?
David's father?
That's right. So they believe that the Messiah was going to come out of David's lineage. Okay, so we've established that. So Jesus asked them a question. How can they say that the Messiah is David's son? Which they're probably like, because it says so. Probably what most people would answer. Why is Jesus' question complicated? He explains, right? What does he do?
Well, I mean, like it says in the Psalm, the Lord said to my Lord.
So he quotes
Yeah,
David, right?
yeah.
Okay. Specifically, the Lord says to my Lord. So what he's saying, what he's trying to do here is get them to think about, can the Messiah be the son of David if David calls him Lord? That's kind of that's what's kind of happening here, right?
Mhm.
Okay. So verse 44 is kind of the linchpin in Jesus' statement in question. This could be that we could then ask, about this is the second question Jesus asks. David thus calls him Lord, so how can he be his son? What point is Jesus making in verse 44? Phyllis.
Well, that Jesus wasn't a normal person. He's born after David is his son, yet he is born after David. I mean, yeah, after David dies. So that's like he has to be more than just a human for that to all happen.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. James?
Yes, I was just thinking, well, what I was thinking is they put a lot more emphasis on who is the son of who. More so, I think, than we do today. Now, I know there's an interest in, looking up the genealogy and all of that. And, but I mean, it was, the names were, it wasn't just they carried on the name. It was like the son of, that's what the name's translated to. And so, anyway, so that being said, I think Jesus is making the point that the son of David, he, the son of man, and can be the Messiah. And even David recognized that, I think, when he wrote the Psalm, or he was impressed to write that. So anyway, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? What point is Jesus making in verse 44? Good comments from Phyllis and James there. The idea here is that not only does the Messiah not have to be like a direct descendant, like immediate descendant. That obviously could not happen. It had not happened. David had been dead for a long time by this point. They're still waiting for the Messiah. But also he's maybe making a deeper point of the divinity of the Messiah. Because this really comes down to the fact that Jesus really is focusing on this idea that David calls him Lord. So maybe he's addressing something about the fact that Abraham and Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, David, these big patriarchal figures in the history of Israel, that they were put on a pedestal, if you will, and they were seen as lords in a way, right? Even though that term would not have been used with them. And there was this whole thing in Jewish culture, which is very much about respecting your elders, right? This whole, idea of there's a certain amount of stature and status that comes with being a senior statesman in your community and in your family and in your city and in your region. So this idea that the Son would be the Lord might have seemed counterintuitive. I'm hypothesizing here. Somebody might have a different view on this, but it seems that Jesus is addressing this issue that, like, well, why would David call his own son Lord? He leaves the question there. Yeah, because the Messiah is more than a descendant. Sure, it was prophesied that out of the root of Jesse, so out of the lineage of David, the Messiah would come, which he did. Jesus did come through that lineage. We can see that in the genealogy. that is listed at the beginning of the book of Matthew. But that the Messiah is more than that. Messiah is God. Messiah is divine. The Messiah is not just David's descendant. So maybe he's addressing something that had to do with the fact that people were putting a lot of weight on, as James was pointing out, on who he was from and who he was of, because your status, your within society was often determined on who your parents were or who your grandparents were. Everything about you and your identity was linked to that. And so maybe he's trying to break that down a bit. Like, he's not David's son. He came out of the line of David, but David is his son in a way, right?
Yeah.
And Jesus is the son of the Father and the son in the Godhead. So I think there's something else going on here of Jesus not only like trying to bring this reality of who the Messiah is, as Phyllis pointed out, but also what the Messiah is, and that it's a much bigger thing than most of them had considered or wrapped their minds around. We know some were out to get him because they were threatened by what he was doing. They felt that their status, their wealth, their power, their positions were all threatened by this. Some very selfish reasons why they're out to get him. But I think there were also a lot of people who were challenged by Jesus because it didn't fit within their paradigm of like what they were expecting, both in the idea of a king that would overthrow Rome, but also like I think they had kind of boxed in their idea of who the Messiah was and what the Messiah was going to look like based on some of these cultural factors. So maybe Jesus is trying to expand the thoughts for those people and trying to show them that the Messiahship is not really about David or Joseph or anybody in the lineage. It's about Jesus. And that's the most important part of it. So that's what I think is partly what's going on here. But let's keep reading here and unpack some other aspects of this. Would somebody read verse 46 to 47 for us again?
I'll read that.
Thanks, Laura.
Excuse me. Verse 46. Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honors at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation.
So what do you think about this? Is Jesus being nice?
Nope.
Is he
No,
being loving?
no.
Tough love.
Said it. And then you were like, I don't know if I should have said that, right? But it's an honest question, right? It doesn't seem like the most loving thing to say.
But I think he's pointing out their issues because he loves them and wants, the best for them. Maybe one of them will change.
He's speaking the truth.
So yeah, that's an important aspect, right? That love isn't deceitful, it doesn't lie. So it might hurt sometimes because the truth hurts. But it's but also like that doesn't mean, when I say that, I think that is exactly what's happening here with Jesus. But when I say that, I'm not condoning that we all have like a blank check to hurt our brothers and sisters with overt criticism in the name of being loving and speaking the truth. Well, I just say it how it is. I just say things how they are. I'm just right. I mean, we can also use that as an excuse for hurting people. And that's not Christ-like either. Jesus didn't do this very often. In fact, for the majority of his ministry, almost 3 years, he had not a lot of criticism to say to this group of people. He would sometimes buffer their remarks if it was interfering with his ministry in that moment. But it really wasn't until the end here where he starts using terms like "you brood of vipers" and like beware of these people who wear long robes and woe to you, we don't really see that like constant. We see a lot of situations, and I'm sure there's many that weren't recorded where they were there, and Jesus doesn't confront things that are going on or that are problematic in their lives. There's an opportunity for them to just listen and to grow and to see and to witness and to change. And some of the Pharisees, we know Nicodemus, met Jesus, he was a Pharisee. And so it's, I think that's an important thing to realize, is that this is kind of the exception, not the rule. So we can't make that kind of behavior and those kinds of words the rule and then say like, well, I'm just like Jesus, I'm just speaking the truth. But we also have to remember that if we are loving, there are going to be moments, and when we are being loved, there's going to be moments that might hurt a bit. But is its purpose to hurt, or is its purpose to help? In which case, then maybe we can just swallow our pride for a moment and grow from it. Yeah. Okay. Good comment on that one. What else is happening here? Is Jesus being unkind? What do you think? How do you respond to the idea that Jesus isn't being very loving here? Aaron.
I'm wondering if it has, like, if it's linked to what he said before about David, about the Messiah being God's son. Because then he goes into like talking about people's like kind of trying to put themselves on a higher, like, hierarchy than those, the people or whatnot, like the scribes are trying to look more, I guess, holy or more higher up than the others. And so Jesus is the Lord. So he's basically saying like drawing their attention to the fact that he's the one that's like really the one that's higher up than all of them. But how does he behave? Like, he's very humble and doesn't like try to lord it over others or whatever. So I don't know if that has like a link to like what he said before, like he was just moving into like trying to draw their minds to that fact.
It definitely has a link to what comes after, for sure. So it probably has a link to what came before as well. What are some of the things that Jesus criticizes here? What are some of the specific behaviors, Aaron?
One thing that I did kind of just made me think of was when he talks about they walk in long robes, and I think I read something about how like they would have like these, like they would try to make their hems like really like big and stuff, because that showed like, I don't know if that was like a status thing or like how holy they were or whatnot. But that reminds me of in Isaiah 6, how God's like hymn fills the entire like sanctuary. So that's like showing like how holy, God is. So I just like drop that, trying to draw my mind to that.
I think it's more of a royalty thing. It was seen as like, first of all, you'd have to be a person of means to be able to afford the extra fabric and the extra stitching and everything that would come with these elaborate hymns. In the case of the Lord in that vision that Isaiah has, I definitely think, because it's the throne room is where it says that takes place. And it says, yeah, the hem of his garment fills the entire throne room, right? And there's cherubim and who are flying and, covering their feet, hands and their feet and their faces. And there's a whole imagery going on there. Well, likewise, I think the same thing goes here. Like, if, in Western culture, we've kind of adapted this in a post-monarch society where, it still happens at weddings, right? The idea that these trains and like the longer the garment, the bigger the garment, the more material, has some sort of implication of importance. And so there was definitely an association with that, for sure. 2,000 years ago, and this idea of like you're a person of importance, even if it wasn't necessarily in the context of royalty, it had that same kind of thought and idea. So yeah, these long robes, they show that I'm an important person because I can afford this and I'm wearing it. It states my status. So there's a lot of things that come with that kind of garment in that setting. I mean, what might that be a parallel to in today's society?
They're just showing off. It's just a show off thing. Like, oh, look what I have. Look what I can wear.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about, like a fine men's suit with, 3-piece and the pocket
Mhm.
watch and the nice tie. And,
Italian stitching,
yeah.
hand tailored. You can tell the difference, like you can tell when somebody bought a suit at Macy's or Kohl's, and when somebody bought, a $1,500 suit or more, right? Like there's a look, there's a way it fits and things like that. There are also like something, so you can ornament it with ties and things that make it more or less flashy. But yeah, you could definitely do the same thing with those kinds of garments today. James.
Once upon a time, you could get a tailored suit in Hong Kong for $99.
At the expense of probably some other less desirable things. Yeah. When I was in Asia, that was our big dilemma. There were some people in our group who wanted to go get these really beautiful suits and things. And we were all college students. It was a real item of discussion on the bus, because, and in the hotel, it was like, the only reason they're available that cheap is because of the kids downstairs who were running the sewing machines. So it created, for me, it was great to have that conversation piece that we were able to at that age be able to think about, like, oh, so what are because we were just like, oh, how great, we're poor college students, and like we could like go home with this like amazing product, but then we had to like look at the ethics of it, and challenged us, because when you're 21, you're not necessarily wanting to think about that. You're like, I could get this amazing suit that I couldn't afford at home,
Right.
Yeah.
Which is a better, actually, the whole scenario that you just described is much better than, say, another group of college kids who are not only singing 99 beers on the wall, they're going to try to consume 99 beers.
And pick up a couple suits while they're at it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could have been thinking about that. So I think it's pretty cool that you had this ethical decision to make.
Well, I don't remember who introduced it. I don't think it was me, but at least I was around people who like we were able to challenge each other that way. Yeah. Anybody else? What are well, we've already, I guess, answered that question. What's another specific behavior thing that Jesus criticizes or points out here?
That they devour widows' houses.
What does that mean?
Not sure.
Kick them out of their own house after their husband dies to pay debt or something.
Probably.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I agree with Phil. So I read it also more on a bigger thing of taking advantage of those who maybe, of those who can't maybe defend or don't have the money or means to fight back.
Yep. Any other thoughts on that one?
Well, we have, there's a lot of 50-year celebrations occurring around the country, I guess, or at least here in Florida. And it was about, I don't know the exact date. Phyllis could probably help me, but when women could get credit.
Oh, yeah.
When was that, Phyllis? No, you were already unmuted.
Oh, I'm sorry. In her own name. In the late 60s.
Late 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's like 50. That's okay. 51 years ago. But yeah,
I have the original marriage certificate of my great grandparents, And interestingly enough, when we found it, it was in an envelope from a bank that had been mailed back to my great grandmother. Her husband had been dead for a few decades by that point. This is the middle of the 20th century. And so not that long ago. And interestingly enough, the reason it was in a bank and had been mailed back to her was because she didn't have a husband. She was a widow. She had to use her marriage certificate with her, at that time, dead husband. For the bank used that to hold for a note in order to give her a loan. And the terms of the loan are written on the back of the marriage certificate. And so the marriage certificate was, because there were things she couldn't do without a marriage certificate. So the bank held that almost like a, as a lien kind of deal against the loan. And then they mailed it back to her when the loan was paid in full. And so, and also we found her voting card, which only allowed her to vote because of her husband. It was all done through her husband, like registered through her husband. It's all very interesting. Yeah. So it's not that long ago that women, even in our society, could easily be, taken, had incredible financial hardships if their husband had died, or if they didn't have a husband, or if they were a widow, or whatever the case was. So, bank comes after you for a debt your husband had, or you don't have much means, you're barely surviving. Instead of like helping you maintain your housing and shelter, says that the reason, well, you wouldn't be a widow if you hadn't done something against God, or if your husband hadn't done something against God. So here, let's just take this money and give it to the church for our own benefit. Buy some extra long robes. That's how I read that. Yeah. What else? What other behavior does Jesus criticize in here? James.
Well, actually, this brings up another discussion, and which is for another day, but I'm going to go ahead and put it out there that in this group, there's a couple of us that are near 70 years old. Oof. And so we remember what happened. I mean, remember, we were 20 something 50 years ago, or 19 years. And so we were old enough, to make decisions that carried us through the rest of our lives, or not. Anyway, so we have that experience. But how do you convince an 18-year-old, say, of these things when you're trying, because ultimately we're trying to spread the gospel. So how do you approach someone of that age that doesn't have a clue about these kinds of things? So
well, like you said, it's a discussion for another day. I have several thoughts on that, but
yeah,
it would, I think, take us quite down a rabbit hole. So we'll leave that as a rhetorical question, if that's okay. And let everyone think on that in their own time. Is there any other behavior here that we should look at?
They make lengthy prayers for a show.
Yeah, that's a great one, because it's the only one in the list that's like a spiritual thing, right? So they're doing something that's seen as like a good, holy, spiritual thing, but they're doing it in a way and for a purpose that, sure, we've all heard those prayers that turned into sermons. The person giving the prayer thought they should have been preaching the sermon. Right? I mean, like, what does that accomplish? Like, I mean, just say a prayer. Just talk to God. It can be simple. It doesn't need to be long. Like, I've always been a big proponent of why sharing time around prayer is so important, because when we all share together, that's when we grow together. That's when we can support each other and help each other. We learn about each other's good things, and we learn about the struggles and sufferings that people around us are dealing with. God hears all that. Like, we don't need to restate it. We don't have to regurgitate it again. in a formalized way for him to have heard it, and our prayers don't have to be long and lengthy. They can be, but a lot of times long prayers are many times they're done in a very public setting, and the appearance of I can speak well and I can choose words well and I know how to pray. It's very, not only is it contradictory to the statement Jesus says here, but it really, it hinders things. The number of people I've met, you ask them to pray and they won't, because they've been conditioned to believe they don't know how to pray, because they've been in these churches with these master prayers, right? Who drone on and on. And so I think it actually is very harmful in some ways, because we don't make prayer as meaningful as it should be, and as approachable and as organic and natural and unsophisticated as it can and maybe should be. Phyllis.
I was just thinking about how that when the disciples asked Jesus to teach them how to pray, he gave them the Lord's Prayer, which is a very simple yet beautiful way to pray. And that was our example. It wasn't that we could use all these different words and connections and everything. It was a very simple kind of way to pray.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the one example Jesus gave for us. Yeah. Also interesting, the prayers for healing are like super short. They're, he has a conversation with the people there sometimes, but then it's just like, these prayers are very, very short. I think that says a lot about just say what you mean. Just talk to God. Just say what you mean. Don't need to beat around the bush. I will confess
you're talking to a living God. You're not talking to just, some person in the air or just something. You're talking to a living person. So talk to him.
I like that. I'll confess that some of my private prayers are rather lengthy. That's usually because I'm rambling and trying to find my thoughts. But I feel like that's a natural part of outgrowth of my relationship with God, and he meets me where I'm at on that too. But probably shouldn't do that in front of people, especially for the purpose of showing people. Well, in that case, it wouldn't make me look particularly as a good communicator, but if I'm doing them in a way to anything that's done in prayer to make me look better. Lord, thank you that I'm not like that sinner, right? That prayer of the Pharisee that Jesus tells. Classic example of this. Anything else we want to look at before we move on? They like to be greeted. Yeah.
I was just thinking about where they the thing. Don't do vain repetitions.
Right.
Yeah.
Phyllis, do you have a comment?
I was just looking back over this verse 45 and 46. All these things that he's mentioning, they desire to go around in long robes. They love greetings in the marketplace, the best seats at synagogues, the best places at feasts. All of that is public recognition of who they are. Nothing about how they perform or what they're doing in the name of God. It's all about I don't know what you would call it these days, but the celebrity, if you will, of being a Pharisee.
Status.
Yes, it's all about them.
Right.
Like, look at me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look at me. Yeah.
So that kind of, that starts to answer this question, but let's dig in that a little deeper in the comparison. What's the difference between these leaders and the widow of verses 1-4 of chapter 21? Are these stories connected? If so, let's talk about how they're connected and compare them. What do you think?
Well, the widow was very humble. And she, she went to the treasury and she put in all she had. which wasn't very much. And the wealthy people were just throwing stuff in, just like out of their abundance. So,
I think these stories are linked just by the speech that Jesus just gave, saying that, yeah, they like to be seen and have the best seats in the synagogue. And, it says, and when he looked up, he saw the rich putting their offerings into the basket, like they're making a show of it. Here it is. Look at me putting it in. So that's how I think that they are linked. They basically gave him a great example, springboarding off of what he just said.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I would just like to add to what Sarah said too, that the widow was humble. I mean, it doesn't say, but it gives me the feeling that she did this in private where no one knew about it but Jesus. She wasn't, calling attention to herself at all, in addition to putting in all that she had.
Right. Yeah. Anyone else? Thoughts on comparing these stories? How do the leaders of verses 45 through 47 compare with the widow? Let's go ahead and jump to this then. Let's take a look at verse 4 specifically. What is Jesus's message about the widow? What is he saying here? What is the meaning of verse 4? Lori.
I think in reading that, he's saying, they put in out of their riches, which was just a small percentage of what they had. So to me, it's like an everyday thing. Okay, well, we'll give the money. But with the widow, she was basically, say, putting out of her poverty. That's all she had. And she wasn't saying, I'll wait till another time or I'll give more. I'm giving now from my heart, even though I'm not going to have anything left. And that's the difference to me between the two.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Carlene.
The value of the gift, I think he's teaching here, is not the amount, but by the proportion that it's given and the motive that actuates the giver. I think that's the determination of the value.
Like that. Yeah. Great thoughts. Phyllis.
I also think it can add, this is a little different, but it can add to the idea that the widow is trusting God to take care of. If this is all she had, then she's putting more trust in God that he's going to take care of her. Where the Pharisees are like, they're self-sufficient, or, they have enough to live on after they pay whatever they pay. So there is a little more for her because she's not only giving all she had, but that means that she's going to have to trust God.
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, I mean, she's a widow, so she has no husband to take care of her. So she has to trust God.
Really like what Carlene said. The value is determined by proportion and motive. Jesus, we often say that the amount doesn't matter, but that's not what Jesus is saying here, because actually the amount greatly mattered for the widow. It wasn't just motive. It was the fact that she was giving everything she had. We just like to think about amounts with dollar signs, like fixed amounts. But that term proportional, the proportion of it, that's a really key concept. The amount did matter because the amount she gave in proportion to what she had was what gave it immense value. Whereas the people who had much. I mean, this is a great lesson, I think, for all of us in our current rather affluent society that we live in, whether we like to believe we're fall into that, you can use that word for ourselves or not. Reality is we probably can. There is probably more surplus than we like to believe there is. We just maybe we use it on things that we shouldn't or don't need to. But that if we're just giving what's available and left over, that's exactly what Jesus is criticizing the wealthy people in this story about. And so that there's a really, I think, a hard lesson being taught here. Aaron.
Yeah, I think like what everybody's saying, that God wants us to turn over everything in our life to his care. And I think that includes like our control, like our or like what we, I guess, think we have control over in our lives. Like because I'm thinking about like turning over everything is kind of like a scary thought, because then it's like I don't have any control like over like, and I want to have control. So like I think that's God's message though, is like trust me, and like I'll take care of I'll take care of you if you turn over everything to me. Like I can be trusted for that. So I think that's like what he's trying to tell like his disciples.
Yeah, it's a great point. That there's a deeper concept here. It's not just about money, but money is something that frequently maybe keeps us from relinquishing control. And that's why like this idea of the widow giving everything she had was such a big deal, because by doing so, and to Phyllis's point as well, she not only like affirmed her trust in God, but she was turning everything over to him, not just her pocketbook. Like it was her entire life, her ability to eat, her ability to have shelter and to be safe and to like survive in the world. In that moment, she turned that over to God. That's I mean, that's a really important, powerful thing. I've heard it suggested, and I don't necessarily disagree, and I shouldn't even say it like that. I don't disagree that regardless of how much money we have, there are times when maybe we just need to give it all to God. It's a very unpopular concept because some preachers and some televangelists have used that line in order to like buy a private jet, right? And that's obviously not what I'm suggesting by any means here. But that from a first person perspective, speaking as somebody who's giving, somebody who's like looking at my own life and my own relationship with God and what my financial giving looks like there might be times when I need to just be okay giving all my financial resources, because if they're in any way holding me back, or if they're in any way, if I'm in any way hiding my own control and not relinquishing that to God, if they're keeping me from surrendering one aspect of my life or something to him, then I in that moment need to actually give everything, not because God needs all of it, but because it's hurting me by having it. And so that's the other part of giving that we don't like to talk about a lot either, right? Is the idea that it sometimes is more for the giver than God could get money, he could get resources, he's miraculously accomplished things and all sorts of communities of faith and people's individual lives for millennia. It's not an issue. But we do need to give in order to not only participate in the work that he's set forth, but also to let go, to be able to like relinquish control of something that I think it's safe to say has held every single one of us back at some point. At some point, I'm sure every single one of us, because of money, has not made the decision that God was leading us to make in that moment. Maybe there was someone in need, but we were also feeling like we were in grave need, and maybe we felt like we couldn't help that person because of that. Maybe it was as simple as just like tithe and we hadn't been working. We got our first check and we were behind on bills and things. And if we paid tithe, there might be one bill that went unpaid or something. And it doesn't seem like it makes sense there. It could be a myriad of circumstances, but we need to realize that this is not about God needing money. It's about us not needing it to control us. Carlene, yeah.
I think also the bigger picture is this is not just a problem that happened then, or as we're talking, happens now, but this goes back to, well, think of the book of Deuteronomy, the things that they were cautioned against, and the widows, the fatherless, the stranger within your gates. Don't hesitate to assist, to help, and not to judge that's those situations either. I mean, way back then, that was the problem, and that was the warning. And it just kind of keeps on, because that's our nature, sadly to say.
Mm-hmm.
We need to continually be reminded.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Any other thoughts on this? Comments? Thank you for that, Carlene. Yeah, it was really great. Phyllis.
I'd like to just go back before the widow, because when I was looking back in Matthew, the concordance in the middle of the Bible here mentions that the whole thing about beware of the scribes can also be found in Matthew 23, verse 1 to 36. And that, in Matthew's account, he goes into more detail. First of all, Jesus is not admonishing the Pharisees with all of these, what they're doing, like, getting the best seats and making a show of everything. He's doing this publicly because in the first verse and in verse 20, in chapter 20, verse 45, it says, then in the hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples. And so when I look back at Matthew 23, it said the same thing there, that it was to a multitude of people that Jesus was saying this, and the disciples. So he's kind of outing them to all of this group of people. It's not like that he's speaking directly to them only and telling them that they shouldn't be doing that. And it's interesting that almost after every verse, Jesus begins with woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And that's like repeated throughout the chapter 23 in Matthew. Yep. Because like everything that he's saying to the people that they've done wrong, that the Pharisees have done wrong, he's admonishing them for it and saying, woe to you. And I think that's a big thing, or should have been a big thing for the people, because the people is a crowd of probably a whole lot more people were like the widow than like the Pharisees that he's talking to. So it's kind of giving, I think he's giving them a look inside of the Pharisees' lives and what they're really like. And I just thought that was interesting, that this wasn't just a private kind of, little dialogue, but yet something that he was talking. It says he spoke loud enough that the people could hear him. Then in the hearing of all of the people. So he was wanting everyone to know what the Pharisees were doing. If they didn't already, he wanted them to know. And I think also that this could be connected to like some people's idea of what the Catholic Church is like, and the Pope and how he's holy and all this kind of thing, that people used to be, they didn't know what was really going on within that church, and how they were using money and how they were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing, even the Pope. And so I think in today's world, people are seeing more of what these holier people are really like. And, even with the pastors that are trying to get the money so that they can build the message and buying the jets like you're talking about, because it's so transparent these days. Now we're seeing that even among the leaders of today. But I just thought it was interesting that Jesus is saying this loud enough that everybody can hear it. And he keeps saying, woe to the scribes and Pharisees, and how they're hypocrites.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's actually Matthew 23 does expand on this extensively, and would be a great discussion at some point, the entire chapter. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected weightier matters of the law, that is justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. Woe to you, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence. Woe to you, you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and of the kinds of filth. So also you look righteous on the outside, but inside you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Those are a few of the things listed here. Definitely goes along with what we read and what we've been discussing from Luke. The long robes, the long prayers, like to be seated in places of importance, like to be seen and recognized. That totally fits in with exactly what is expanded upon in the account is recorded in Matthew. And that's a great point, Phyllis, that this was a very public statement. So we've kind of talked about the fact that Jesus at this point seems a little less concerned about the fallout from addressing some of these things with these very important leaders. His time has come. He knows that. And so he's wrapping up his ministry with some very sharp criticisms. And in the book of Matthew, even it's more poignant, right? And doing it in front of a big group of people, whereas in the, earlier in his ministry, he probably would have been like, he would have done it quietly, or don't go tell anyone I did this, or, just so that his ministry could have continued to exist and thrive. But at this point, that does not seem to be the priority. The priority at this point is now to offer this very, very sharp criticism. Thank you for that, Phyllis. So along those lines, what thoughts and feelings would have been going through your mind if you were one of the religious leaders listening to Jesus in this public setting? How would you have been feeling and thinking? Jesus says these things. Aaron.
I'm pretty sure I would be embarrassed and feeling like looking around like, oh, are the people like looking at me? Like, yeah, I would be like really embarrassed and like I get probably like ashamed and stuff.
James?
If I was one of the religious leaders at the time, I would be incensed and think, who died and made this guy Messiah?
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like if you've committed to that way of life, if you've committed to those things, that then at this point, we don't know. Some people may have converted as a result of this, but we do know that more than that, several of them did not. And all it did was like, they're like, okay, well, see, there's no way this guy could be Messiah because, he's criticizing me.
I'd be justifying it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Justifying it. He doesn't know. He doesn't understand. He doesn't know he doesn't know what it's like to be in charge of the church and how this works. He doesn't get it. We have to make those decisions. We have to interact with some very important people. If we didn't have these robes, they wouldn't take us seriously. Phyllis.
Yeah, I think they might use the comment, well, that's just the way it's always been. It's kind of like that's the perks of getting this high, of the job.
Yeah. Which is automatically means they're completely disconnected from the reality of spiritual things as as Jesus was trying to help them understand, because by getting that high, you should be low, right? Like you should be lower by getting higher. That's what happened with Jesus, and that's what he condoned and said what should happen to all. If you're, if you got up to this place of importance, then you're probably pretty low when it comes to issues of righteousness, because you've got it backwards. All right, next question. We're only kidding ourselves if we think that in today's culture, we're not at a risk for this kind of hypocrisy. In what areas of life have you been tempted to live a double-faced life or a life of hypocrisy? What areas of your life have you struggled with hypocrisy a bit on? This requires a significant amount of self-honesty. So we're gonna challenge ourselves right now to be honest with ourselves, even if it's a little uncomfortable. And maybe you'd be willing to share. It's an area of your life that you've been challenged with hypocrisy. Aaron.
I think all areas, probably, because I become kind of aware that, like, pretty aware that, like, I just kind of like am like a chameleon, sort of. Like, I'll just like be whoever, like, people around me, like, I think they want me to be, like, a lot of the time. And so, like, if I'm with this person and they're this, like, I'll pretty much just like try to fit in, like with the way they think. And if I don't agree with them, like, a lot of times I won't say anything. Like, I'll just be quiet or whatever to, like, I guess, be accepted or whatever. So I think, like, I try to be me, but, like, also I think, like, there's a lot of aspects where I am like wearing like a mask, I guess, or whatever. So that's like being hypocritical.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, really appreciate that. Anyone else willing to share a time or something in your life that you have found tempted to be hypocritical?
I think for me, sometimes it's a financial aspect where, offerings need to hurt a bit sometimes. They have to be sacrificial, or there's this need or that need. And then, something will come up and I'll think, oh, I need to keep this money for retirement or a rainy day fund. I can't let that go. So that's something that I go back and forth on, and thankfully Justin often will, do we really need to? We have this, we can do that. So it's for me, I do struggle sometimes just letting go of the long-term financial worry. And I'm talking like retirement, 20, 30 years financial worry. I worry about that now, which is good, but not in the minute little things that I really shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that, Laura. Anyone else? Phyllis.
I think that I can be hypocritical when I am even volunteering to do something, volunteering to help an organization. I'll volunteer to help that organization, but then when they want me to do something that I really don't want to do, it's like, well, that's not what I want to do. I want to pick what I volunteered to do. It's like, I like to do these kinds of things. I don't want to do those kinds of things, like things that are not, I don't care to get involved in, like I wouldn't be able to be a volunteer person at a hospital who had to clean up after people, when they're sick.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to volunteer to do that. But I'd volunteer to do something else, like deliver flowers or something. But I'm just saying that even in being a volunteer, I can be hypocritical in the way that I look at. So do I really want to do what's needed, or do I want to pick something else?
Mm. Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. I think that gives all of us a lot of food for thought. James.
Actually, I took my hand down.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
All right. So when faced with the temptation to be hypocritical or live a double-faced life, what gives you strength to stand strong and do what is right? So how do you help? What are some ways you overcome the temptations of hypocrisy? And let's be clear, the way I said that, I'm not implying that we're all tempted specifically to be hypocrites. We're typically tempted to do something or to have certain selfish desires or feelings in a situation that are different than maybe what we're saying or how we're presenting things to other people. That then becomes hypocrisy, right? So what we're really talking about is a situation where the temptation to allow our selfish desires to govern us, but then when we're speaking a different message, that it then becomes the hypocrisy. So yeah, how are some ways we combat that and handle that situation? Carlene.
I resonate really with what Phyllis just had to say, in volunteering and being picky, I guess you could say, as to what you are going to do. Is it what I really want, or is it what the Lord's wanting me to do? And whenever I'm faced with some situation, and I'm tempted strongly to either not do it or ignore it or act like it didn't happen or doesn't exist, I have to think about the issues in my life that have already happened. And if I think and look on experiences that I've had, whether they're ones that I neglected or that I went through, how the blessings that were received at that point, the assistance, and also afterwards, the big picture of how it enabled other things to happen. When I think, I think on those things, and it helps me to be stronger in what I have to do now, or what I need to do now.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else want to share how you deal with these temptations that lead to hypocrisy? How do you cope with that? How do you maintain authenticity, transparency? I'd say, for me, part of it is like making sure like I have a system of people who are gonna like keep me in check. I think that's right. We can all create situations by having corridors in our mind and in our relationships that kind of cut people off from certain sides of us, certain parts of us, so that number one, we don't think they'll be savvy to it. But then that means there's always going to be a gap in distance, right? You can never get like close enough to somebody if you have those compartments and barriers. Some people just live that way. Different people in different compartments at different arm's lengths. That's one way that we can kind of like facilitate hypocrisy, is when we start doing things like that. So by removing those barriers, by removing those walls, by trusting people, flawed people around us, it allows us to be kept accountable and in check, because they're going to hear what we said to that other person, but then they're going to see what we did in this other situation when that person wasn't around. There's going to be people like that in our lives. And so I think that that's actually a very positive thing, as long as they're the kind of person that's going to like hold us accountable in that moment. So being able, I think it's a really easy game to like fool ourselves, and to convince ourselves that we're somehow fine. It's a different game when, and I don't know if you've ever noticed about yourself, I've noticed it myself. I've also seen it happen in other people where you behave differently when there's somebody else in the loop. I mean, a great litmus test is always to just be like, okay, let me say this in front of so-and-so. I would not say that in front of, why wouldn't I say that in front of so-and-so? Start examining like, there's something, weird about this scenario. What is so weird about that? And I think that opens the door and enlightens us a bit on maybe where our behavior is flawed, maybe where we've fooled ourselves into thinking that something is right and good and it's really not, or that our motivations were off. And maybe we've suppressed that, so we're not as aware of it. And it might even be a subconscious thing. So I think having good relationships and good friendships with godly people around us who can hold us accountable is one thing that's worked for me, and that I think is very beneficial in a lot of ways. Anyone else want to speak to how you handle this issue of temptations that lead to hypocrisy? All right. Let's read verses 1-4 of chapter 21 again. We talked about this extensively, but let's just read those verses. Do I have a volunteer who would read those 4 verses?
Again.
Thanks, Laura.
And he, being Jesus, and he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them, for they all out of their surplus put into the offering. But she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on.
The question here is, do you feel you live a life like the life of the widow? If not, what changes do you need to make? Do you feel you live a life like the life of the widow? If not, what changes do you need to make? And if so, what led you to that place?
I will say no. I do not live a life like the widow. And one of many changes I would need to make is just my faith walk with Jesus, that when I do something, when I either whether or not it's an action or maybe something spiritual, whatever it is, I don't have enough faith that whatever might come of that because of my action or a decision I make, that I don't have enough faith that God will make up for that difference, that deficit, whatever you want to call it. And so I think the first thing that I would have to work on is just, like Carlene said a few minutes ago, thinking back about what has happened in my life and what the good things that have come about and how he has taken care of me, using that as a foundation to remember that God does take care of me, and that if I do step out in faith to give some money, take care of something, help someone out, whatever it might be, something for the church, that God will then in retrospect take care of me.
Thanks, Laura. Anyone else? Do you live a life like the life of a widow? If not, what changes do you need to make? And if so, what led you to that place? What got you there? Phyllis.
I would say no. Like Laura, I do not live a life like that. And I think that what I would need is more faith and trust in God. And also to look back, like has been said, at how he's kept me. I've never gone without food. That I, for more than a day, if that. And I've never been in want. I've always had a place to sleep. And, it's just like, he's going to take care of me in the future. And it may not be at the same kind of comfort level it is right now, but he will take care of me. That I know. I just have to, I think, get in the word more and pray more, that I will definitely trust God and know that I don't have to worry about what's going to happen in the future, because the future is not promised to us anyway. And, and anything that we have, we know can be gone in a moment. Fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever. I mean, it can be gone in a moment. So I need to not put my trust in the earthly things and put more of my trust in God.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Does anybody else want to answer this question? Do you feel you live a life like the widow? And if not, what changes do you need to make? Or if so, how'd you get there? All right. Well, that was our last question for today. So I hope you all enjoyed the study. It was nice to see you all and talk about this. There's some other very pointed things coming up here in this chapter that we'll be studying about the next couple of weeks, as Jesus' tone and topic continues to shift, and as he starts to wrap things up. So I hope you all join us again next week, 4:00 on Saturday, Eastern time, for our study. We'd be glad to have you, and those of you watching on Facebook and YouTube as well. So let's take a moment and bow our heads for a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for speaking to us directly when we need it. And we just pray that we would take these words to heart, whatever in our life we're doing for show or to be seen or to feel important. We just pray, Lord, that you would humble us and that we might always direct the focus to you and not to ourselves. We pray that you would teach us how to live a life of sacrifice, one where we don't hold on to material things or money or even our ego and pride, where we can make you first in all that we do, where everything that happens in our life is all seen as an outpouring of your grace and your mercy and your love. And that people would see that in the way we live and the things we say. Lord, help us not to be hypocrites. We know we will be at some point or another, and that we probably have been already. But we just pray, Lord, that you would help us to become more like you, more authentic and transparent, and that you would perfect us, that the things that tempt us and the sins that are in the way, that we would rely on you and through your power overcome those things. Thank you for your love. Thank you for this group and this family where we can share and encourage each other and talk through these things together. We just pray this in your name. Amen. Thank you again, everyone. We'll see you next week.